My name is Adam Kokotovich, who is traveling abroad. Before we introduce the speaker, I'd like to open it up for any GES-related announcements that there may be.
Make sure that you, if you're interested in signing up for the Margaret Atwood related, event-related courses, that you do that. The information is on our website, which is just go.mcsu.edu, and then you go /Atwood, and you'll find all the events information on that. There are 4 courses right now that are going to be tied to that event. There's a English, there's a STS, there's Women and Gender Studies, and then there's Colloquium. So make sure that you share that with folks that are thinking about it.
Because if you sign up for Colloquium, you'll have an opportunity to be in a smaller group discussion with her. Not super small, 90 people, 80 people, but it'll be smaller than the 1,000 people that will be at the public event. So the students will lead that particular
They'll get to talk to her.
event too. The students will be on panels for that particular, the student event, the 80 or so student event. So there's a benefit to signing up for Colloquium. There's already a great benefit, but this is another benefit. So.
Thank you. Other announcements? Okay, I will make one. We will be going out for lunch afterwards, and we have some room left, so if you have any interest in going out to lunch, please see me afterwards, and we'll organize that. So we are lucky today to have Dr. Emily Pechar, who is speaking with us. She began her academic career at Georgia Tech, where she received a BS in International Affairs and French. She then went on to work at a consulting agency for 3 years before she returned to academia at Duke, where she recently, as in last month, completed her PhD in environmental policy. Her research focuses on what informs people's attitudes on scientific and environmental issues and how these attitudes inform policy preferences. So it's a great opportunity to have her here speaking with us today, and welcome, Emily.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming and inviting me. It's been a long trip down the 20 miles from Durham to come here today, but I'm really happy to be here and really happy to be a part of this amazing group and colloquium. I am going to be presenting to you today a paper that I published with some of my colleagues last year called Beyond Political Ideology, the Impact of Attitudes Towards Government and Corporations on Trust in Science. And this paper, Jason Delborn actually helped review it and provided a lot of great comments, and the reason why it's applicable here is that we look at trust in science on genetically modified foods as well as climate change. So really excited to share with you the results of this research. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction, you covered it pretty well, but I just finished my PhD in environmental policy up at Duke. I'm joint in the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Stanford School of Public Policy. Generally, my research studies studies politics and public opinion on environmental and science issues, specifically the role that identities play in driving our attitudes. So both partisan identities as well as aspects of nonpartisan identities that shape how we think about science and environmental issues. So back in 2015, I was at a conference with my advisor, Fritz Mayer, and we ran into Thomas Bernauer, who is the other collaborator on this project from ETH Zurich, and we started talking about the role that identities play in whether an individual trusts or distrusts science. So there's been a lot of talk recently about this crisis in trust in science, this idea that the public doesn't trust science anymore, and that that's impacting our ability to make evidence-based policies. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit more, specifically looking at how identities drive trust in science. So we formed a research collaboration between our 3 schools, so the School of Public Policy at Duke, the School of the Environment, and the Institute for Science and Technology Policy at ETH Zurich, to look at these questions in a cross-cultural way, both in the United States and in Europe. So this partnership has resulted in the publication I'm going to present to you today, which was published in the journal Science Communication last year. And we're also working on revisions to a second paper building off of this. That's a more experimental paper trying to see how different messages and messaging sources about climate change and GMOs impact policy attitudes on those two issues. So if we get time, I'm going to try to keep it to time today, but if we have time at the end, I have some preliminary results from that paper to share with you as well, just to get your thoughts and feedback on that too. So the motivation for this project is the idea that public opinion really matters for policy making. Now, some people might think this is obvious, some people might think there's a lot of other things that go into policy making besides public opinion, but particularly for science policy, public opinion and public trust in science is very important for evidence-based policy making. So there's a lot of instances where we have policies, particularly on science issues, that are made that reflect public opinion that might be different than scientific opinion. So we can think of a lot of examples here. The two issues that we're focusing on, climate change in the United States, scientists overwhelmingly agree that climate change is due primarily to human causes, and that reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, is required to address climate change. Public opinion on that in the United States is not so cohesive, and we have policies right now that are more reflective of public opinion than of the science. You can think about, we're seeing the same kind of thing around GMOs and GMO foods, particularly in Europe. So in Europe, public opinion is very wary of GMO foods, whereas the science on GMO foods is generally supportive of the GMOs that are already, that have been approved by the FDA are generally thought to be safe by scientists for human consumption. But particularly in Europe, we see a lot of policies designed to limit or label GMOs in our foods, or even restrict it completely. So as scientists, if we have a goal of increasing evidence-based policies, it's really important to understand public opinion on science, public trust in science, and increase levels of public trust in science in order to influence this kind of policy making. I'd like to share this graphic as an example and as a baseline for where we're starting with. This is a study that was done by the Pew Research Center in 2015. And what they did is they did two different surveys. They did one survey, a representative sample of US adults, and asked them their attitudes on a number of science policy issues. And then they also did a similar survey among all scientists in the AAAS organization. And so what they present here in this graphic, you can see some pretty wide gaps between public opinion on these issues and scientific opinion, particularly on the question of GMO foods, whether or not it's safe to eat genetically modified foods. Also over here on climate change, we see a 37-point gap between public opinion, public views that it's caused by human activity versus scientific views. So this again creates a problem for goals of evidence-based policy making, because if the public is believing one thing that's different from what science is believing, we're unlikely to get science-based policies passed and implemented in the United States. Also, just to clarify, for the purposes of this presentation, when I talk about the scientific consensus on climate change or genetically modified foods, I'm referring to the building off of the data from this study as well as many other studies, but generally the scientific can never have full consensus, but the prevailing scientific opinion here is that genetically modified foods are safe to eat, at least the ones that have been approved by the FDA, and then climate change is mostly due to human activity. I know there's a lot of different perspectives on that, but for the sake of this presentation, that's what I mean when I refer to the scientific consensus. Yes, sorry, I didn't need the pointer. I had those. So thinking about this and thinking about the gap between public opinion and scientific opinion on really important policy issues in the US, we had a number of questions that we wanted to do a public opinion study to understand. So the research questions behind this study were the following. First, what drives public trust in science? What leads people to trust science on one issue but maybe not on another? And then building off of that, do individuals consistently trust science across issues? So in popular media, we often talk about whether or not the public trusts science, and we have this crisis of public trust in science. But maybe it's not that clear to think of trust in science as a singular cohesive term. Maybe people's trust in science varies based on the issue or other factors. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And then our specific research question for this paper was, what role do attitudes towards governments and corporations as components of an individual's political ideology or political identity, what role do they play in driving trust in science in both the US and Germany? So I'm going to unpack this a little bit more over the next couple slides and go over our justification for how we got to this research question. So to start with some background on public trust in science. So initially, over the past 40 or 50 years, the main understanding of public trust in science and whether or not, why the public may or may not trust science had to do with something called the information deficit model of science communication. And this is basically just saying that we can close this public opinion gap between public opinion and scientific opinion by just educating the public on science. So any gaps that we see between what the public thinks on science issues and what scientists think is mostly due to the fact that the public just doesn't know what science thinks. And if we educate the public and we tell them what scientists think, then they're going to agree with the scientists and support science-based policies. Now, a lot of research in recent years has shown that this isn't actually the case. I'm going to go over one specific study done by Dan Kahan at Yale University and colleagues back in 2012 that looked at the effect of scientific literacy, so how much you know about science in general, on your alignment with the scientific consensus on climate change. So according to the information deficit model, Kahan and his colleagues expected that people with low scientific literacy would be far from the scientific consensus on climate change. So their perceived risk of climate change would be low. And then as you go up on science literacy scale, opinions approach the scientific consensus on climate change, and the perceived risk from climate change is greater. So that was their expectation based on this information deficit model. And then what they actually found was the opposite. So they found that among individuals that had low levels of scientific literacy, they perceived a higher risk of climate change. And among individuals with a high level of scientific literacy, they perceived a lower risk from climate change. And this was statistically significant between the two. So this, along with a number of other studies, sheds some questions on this information deficit model of environmental communication, or of science communication, and makes us think, there must be something else going on besides just information provision or scientific knowledge that explains why someone would trust science or not trust science. So over the past couple decades, another potential explanation has come about, and that's the correlation between an individual's political ideology, whether they're liberal, moderate, or conservative, and their overall trust in science. So this comes from some research by Mooney and Gauchat up at Chapel Hill up here that shows that trust in science as a general measure, now that's really important, this is a general measure of trust in science, was significantly predicted by political ideology. And not only that, but the only decline in trust in science over the past 40 to 50 years has been among political conservatives. This is a chart from Gauchat's paper that shows liberals, conservatives, and moderates. So you've got liberals are the diamonds up here. You can see it pretty much stays constant. Moderates have kind of a weird dip and then continue on, but stays pretty level. The biggest decline in trust in science over the past 50 years has been among conservatives who started up here and went down here. So the justification there is that this isn't an everybody problem. This is a problem of trust in science among political conservatives. However, yeah, sure.
What happened in 1980? Like, what?
Right.
Between 1974 and 1980?
Yeah, I don't know why there was a huge dip among moderates. I mean, it was paralleled among conservatives. It could be a Reagan thing, I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember from his paper if he goes into that or not, but yeah.
I want you to, I don't want to derail it, but is this self-identified or is this a construct of items?
Self-identified.
Can I- I'm trying to understand this inversion of moderates and conservatives. That to me is actually the most striking.
Well, how moderates were lower.
How moderates were lower, which ex ante I wouldn't have called necessarily.
Yeah.
It might mean I was born in '88, maybe I just didn't get it.
Moderates are a very tricky group to interpret, especially in the political science world. People that call themselves moderates, that has changed a lot. Who those people are has changed a lot over the past several decades. So it used to be people that really were moderates and very much in the middle, and now oftentimes it's people who feel one way ideologically but don't necessarily align with the party. So a lot of previous Republicans right now consider themselves moderates or independents when actually they're still fairly conservative. They just don't want to align with the Republican Party. Same thing has happened among Democrats at different points as well. So interpreting moderates is difficult.
But it's not Republican, it's conservative.
Yes.
So that wouldn't
But
necessarily-
well,
Again, not to derail.
yeah. I understand your point. I don't know exactly, I don't think Oshot talks too much about the moderates in his paper. So I could conjecture, but I'm not sure if it's, the right thing, yeah.
Along those lines, that the term moderate in political ideology, like you said, was one thing then. The term that is more common, if they're asking the question, would be really independents, and those are two different things.
Yeah.
Independents are certainly not aligned with the party by definition, but they are not necessarily moderate in their beliefs.
Yeah. This was moderate, so this is the same set of questions taken over time from the General Social Survey. So it was consistently asked over time. Any other questions about this in particular? I would encourage you to read the paper. It's a really interesting paper. It's not the main focus of this research that I'm reporting on today, but I would encourage you to check out the paper. It's very interesting. But what I'm going to do now is totally debunk all of this. And so we can move on and focus on even more recent research that shows that actually what they were saying about political conservatives and lack of trust in science, that's not necessarily true. Because some recent research by McCreight and Eric Nisbet and colleagues have found that liberals can distrust science just as much as conservatives can. What matters is the type of science that you're asking about. So Nisbet and colleagues look at these two different types of science, what they call conservative dissonant science, such as climate change or evolution, and then liberal dissonant science, such as fracking or nuclear. And they find that the gaps between public opinion and scientific opinion can be just as large among liberals and conservatives. So this got us thinking about, okay, political ideology obviously plays a role and it has some predictive capability here, but it's not just political ideology that can predict it, so what is it? And these scholars began to open that egg a little bit, but we're trying to push the envelope a little bit further and try to understand what aspects of political ideology or moderators between that are actually doing the work to influence trust in science. So this brought us to attitudes towards governments and corporations. The underpinning theory behind this work is the idea of motivated reasoning. So this is the idea that individuals distrust science when it conflicts with their prior attitudes and worldviews, again with the liberal dissonant science or the conservative dissonant science. So based off this theory, we decided to test two specific types of attitudes that are components of political ideology, but also slightly different and measure slightly different sentiments besides just a broad measure of political ideology, and that is attitudes towards government and corporations. And we chose these for two reasons. First, government and corporations tend to be two of the biggest funders of scientific research. So they might be seen as the sources of more research. So they also oftentimes fund different types of research. So we see a lot more government funding of climate research, for example, than private sector funding, corporate funding of climate change research, and vice versa with GMOs and GMO foods. You see a much more active set of research coming out of corporations in the private sector. And then second, the implications of research, especially on climate change and GMOs, often have different consequences for the role of government and corporations in society. So, for example, scientific findings that require a regulatory response, like we see for climate change, the general assumption is that to address climate change, we need some kind of government involvement. It's a large tragedy of the commons problem. So the implications of the findings of that science require more of a role for government, whereas findings in support of a more free market approach might imply a greater role for the private sector. So findings of research on GMO foods that are generally safe, we don't need as much regulation, and it really allows for greater freedom and a greater role in society for corporations. That might be another driver of this relationship here. Okay, so moving on to the study, what we actually did. We ran a large cross-cultural survey of 1,500 Americans and 1,500 Germans. As I mentioned, this was a collaboration with our colleague at ETH Zurich, and part of what we were interested in is comparing trust in science on these two issues across these two cultural environments, because the actual policy and regulatory realities are very different in Germany and Europe and in the United States on climate change and on GMOs. We also see some strong variation in public opinion on these issues across the two countries. So while public support for climate change policies tends to be much higher in Germany than in the US, there's also higher levels of public concern about GMOs and GMO foods in Europe than in the United States. So we wanted to look at these two different environments to see if our theory was broadly valid or if it was really only specific to the United States. So we used a representative sample survey gathered through the survey firm YouGov. This was run in, I think, the fall of 2016 is when we actually got it into the field. We had two main dependent variables. These were trust in climate change. This was a composite variable made up of the average of 7 questions about trust in climate change science, and then same with trust in GMO science. There was a high level of internal validity of these composite measures. We had alphas of over at least 0.85 for both of these measures. And then we also had 3 independent variables. The first 2 were attitudes towards government and corporations. Similarly constructed to the trust variables, there were composite variables taken from mostly questions a battery of questions taken from the General Social Survey that's asked about your attitudes towards these 2 entities. And then we added a few others that were specific to government and corporations. And then political ideology, so whether the individual self-identified as extremely liberal on a scale to extremely conservative. And we adjusted these for differences in language and culture in Germany, because political ideology doesn't necessarily translate exactly the same way in that cultural context. We also had several different control variables of covariates that we know from previous studies align with trust in science on these 2 different issues. So they included age, gender, income, education, personality measures. So we used the Big 5 personality scores. And we had 2 others, one attitudes towards risk, to try to understand or to try to control the people that were more or less risk averse with these different technologies, as well as a measure of general societal trust. So what we really wanted to make sure that we were not, in these trust in science questions, we wanted to make sure we weren't picking up on any general misanthropy or anything, that people just don't trust any institutions. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick preview of our findings before I jump into the nitty-gritty regression tables that everybody loves. The first is that we find that trust in science is not necessarily fully consistent across issues. So again, reflecting some of the work of Nisbet and colleagues in McCrite et al. And others, we find that it's fairly common that people trust science on one issue, but not on the other. We also find that attitudes towards government and corporations are significantly associated with trust in climate change science and trust in GMO science, even controlling for a broad measure of political ideology. So this shows that these two variables, attitudes towards government and corporations, actually do matter in driving people's trust in various sciences. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about how they matter. We also found a decent amount of consistency across the two country samples. There's a few major differences that I'm going to point out, but this lends broader validity to the findings of this study. Okay, so to start with the results, I just wanted to share some descriptive statistics so you could start to understand what these two samples looked like and how our variables varied over the two samples. So a few things I'd like to point out. The first is that we generally saw higher levels of trust in climate science than GMO science. So you'll note that these tend to be higher than these values. We also saw low levels of trust in GMO science, particularly in the German sample. So much more so, decently more so than in the US sample, which reflects what we know about public opinion and public trust in GMOs and GMO foods in Germany. We also saw slightly more favorable attitudes towards government than corporations in both of the samples. So you'll see higher levels of attitudes towards government here compared to attitudes towards corporations. This was particularly distinct in the United States sample. So just to get you some grounding in what we're looking at broadly, descriptively here. I next want to show the correlations between our two dependent variables. So we had significant correlations between trust in climate science and trust in GMO science in both of the countries, and they were very similar. However, it's important to note that these aren't extremely high correlations. So it only explains about 50% of that variance. And so what we can draw from this is that, yes, people think somewhat the same about science in these two issues, but there's some notable differences, and we can't necessarily say that people have a single cohesive trust in science. We have to think about the specific scientific issue that we're asking them about. Okay, I'm going to get into the Ols regression results. So what we did is we estimated two different models for the German sample and for the US sample. The first model looked at just the effect of political ideology on trust in climate science and trust in GMO science. And then the next model looked at political ideology as well as attitudes towards government and corporations. I'm going to walk through these one by one with you. So this first looking at the German sample, and there's a typo up there, ignore that. It's not a mean, it's the regression coefficient. So looking at the German sample, what we see for trust in science, political ideology, attitudes towards government, and attitudes towards corporations are all statistically significant. They're all associated with trust in climate science. And interestingly, they're all positively, attitudes towards government and corporations are both positively associated with trust in science, trust in climate science. A lot of different factors here, so if I trip up on the words, forgive me. Next, looking at trust in GMO science in the German sample, and I think this is one of the more interesting ones here, because what we see is that in Germany, political ideology is not significantly associated with trust in GMO science at all. But attitudes towards government and attitudes towards corporations are both positively associated with increased trust in GMO science. So that's a really important takeaway from this research, is that particularly on this issue in the German European sample, that political ideology isn't actually a good way to think about what predicts trust in GMO science, but these two other factors that we're investigating are. Okay, next, moving on to the US sample. So the really interesting thing about the US sample, I'm going to talk first about climate science, is this decline in magnitude of our regression coefficient between Model 1 and Model 2. So in Model 1, which again is just looking at political ideology, we see that political ideology is significantly associated with trust in climate science. But when you add in these other two factors, attitudes towards government and corporations, the magnitude of that goes down dramatically, cuts in almost in half. And so it shows that likely a lot of the work in this association here is actually being done by how people feel about attitudes towards government and corporations. And just as a reminder, we're thinking about these two factors, attitudes towards government and corporations, as components or sub-factors of political ideology. We're just really trying to get deeper into what is mediating that relationship between political ideology and trust in science. So some interesting evidence here. I'd also like to note that this is the only place where the direction of attitudes, the direction of the effect of attitudes towards government and corporations is as we expected it. So the idea that favorability of government has a positive effect on trust in climate science, where favorability of corporations has a negative effect. In the rest of them, we actually see positive relationships between both attitudes towards government and corporations and trust in science. So down here in the trust in GMO science for the US sample, we see a similar decline in the magnitude, although not quite to the same extent, and higher magnitudes of attitudes towards government than political ideology, denoting that that may be a stronger association than just a political ideology. Yes?
Have corporations been messaging differently in Germany versus the US about climate science?
They have been messaging in the US than in Germany.
Just since there's a
Yeah.
directional change
Yeah.
and we're trusting corporations more, does it have to do with what the corporations are actually communicating to the public?
I think so. So corporations in Germany for a longer period of time have been more on board with doing something for climate change. Now we're just starting to see some of that language emerge among corporations in the United States, but corporations in the United States are probably at least a decade behind the types of messages that have been shared by corporations. So that's a really good point. That might be shaping how Germans are responding to corporations on that issue than Americans. All right, so just to summarize what we found in these regressions, because I know tables can be overwhelming sometimes. The first is that attitudes towards governments and corporations are associated with trust in science over and above the effect of political ideology. So even controlling for political ideology, we still see that attitudes towards government and corporations are important for explaining why people trust science or do not trust science on these different issues. We see this particularly in Germany. So the association between political ideology and trust in GMO science in Germany was low, or really non-existent, not significant, whereas attitudes towards government and corporations were. So that's a particularly interesting thing on the topic of GMOs in Germany. Okay, across the board, we see that attitudes towards governments are positively associated with trust in climate and GMO science, which is interesting. That was not necessarily what we expected, but it shows that messaging from governments potentially can be positive across the board on these issues. Again, I found it very interesting that trust in climate change in the United States is the only instance where we see that inverted relationship between attitudes towards government and attitudes towards corporations on trust in science. So more often than not, both of these entities are positively associated with trust in science. Okay, I'm gonna now just summarize the results here and also talk about the policy implications of what we can draw from these results. The first is harking back to those correlations I showed you. Trust in science across issues is correlated, maybe more so than some other prior research may have suggested. but they're not completely aligned. So a 0.5 correlation is decent, but not great. The implication here is that scholars really need to be careful when they're talking about trust in science and emphasize that trust in science depends on the issue in question. It's not a cohesive sentiment that we can say, you know, this person trusts science and this person doesn't. It may matter a lot what scientific issue you're talking about. We also found evidence that attitudes towards governments and corporations may be stronger predictors of trust in science than political ideology. Again, harking back to the research over the past few decades that's really pointed at political ideology as one of the main drivers of trust in science. We're showing here that it's a more complicated story. Political ideology isn't the end-all be-all, and there's subcomponents of political ideology that might be better predictors than just ideology. And what we do need, though, is more research on perceptions of the source of the science and the impacts of trust in science and the impacts of attitudes towards government and corporations on trust in science, is what that should say. Because the story that we're able to tell through this data is not quite as clean as we had initially theorized. So we really do need more research on how these two mechanisms work and whether there may be another deeper mechanism that may be driving this relationship that we're observing. And then finally, just a note on the cross-cultural nature of this study. So we find similar results across the two countries. We find that attitudes towards government and corporations matter in both Germany and the United States. We find that it may matter more on some issues in Germany than others. We also find that political ideology may be more related to trust in science in the US than in Germany. This is really important for future research when we're looking at trust in science and political ideology, because this may be a reflection of just the highly polarizing nature of our times in the United States, where literally everything becomes predicted by political ideology. And then expanding our studies to Europe, or preferably even other countries that offer more diverse perspectives, might give us a better sense of what's actually driving trust in science. And then I covered that
I have
as
a
well.
question on this, if it's okay right now. So I'm curious why you guys didn't use the Kahan's hierarch, individualist, and communal egalitarian, because that seems to relate to your attitudes towards institutions as well as your political ideology. So yeah.
Yeah,
Cultural cognition theory. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So
It might explain your results too when I think about
yeah,
it.
we've looked at that, and we did include some measures from that
Oh, you did?
in our
Okay.
study. What we were really trying to do is dive a little bit deeper. So the cultural cognition theory is, Dan Kahan and other people have done a lot of work on that and shown its relevance, but I think that what we were trying to get into is more than just some of the typologies that they associate with and use to explain political ideologies. We were trying to dig deeper into what are the underlying attitudes of these ideologies that might be driving these, as opposed to just another way of thinking about
I
political
see your
ideology.
point, but I almost see it in reverse, that the cultural cognition is the underlying ethos of the person, and that affects their trust in institutions and their political ideology. But I mean,
Yeah.
If I could follow up there, because my question would be, how are you all defining attitude, and also how are you all defining trust?
Yeah.
Because if your findings are that trust and attitudes are not such straightforward concepts, we kind of need the
Getting
concepts
into-
actually defined. And maybe one way to answer that is, what questions were you using
Mhm.
to assess attitude, and what questions were you using to
So they
assess
were fairly
trust?
similar
Yeah.
across. So these were our trust in science batteries. These were mostly taken from the paper, Nisbet et al. Paper that measured, they have a battery that they're also using to measure trust in science across political ideologies. So these were there. I'm gonna show you the attitudes as well.
Yeah, because what's missing here are ideas of accountability. I mean, I'm a little troubled by the somewhat straightforward approach to trust, because if you said to me, do you trust such and such? I could, that my answer could mean so many things. It means, it could mean I want accountability. It could mean what you say there about will they do the right thing? That's an ethical question. It could mean, do they have accurate information? Will they actually share accurate information? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's those are really good points. We were building off of the prior boundary use in the publications, because we actually I spent a really long time trying to put these together and understand what's been used in previous surveys. And it's really hard, especially when you're space limited in a survey, to know exactly to make choices.
Did you focus group the survey before you
We
ran it?
did not. That would be an interesting thing to do. So focus group it and try to get deeper at senses of trust. Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
So reading the appendix here, it seems as though the question, I mean, you're framing it as trust in science, but it seems as though the question's really geared towards the community or the scientist. So how does that change? Because this would be more aligned with like Roger Pilkey Jr. and like even Ed Maybach talks about the, like it's the scientists that people are really engaging and have a perception of, like white lab code, this person. And these questions really, in my mind, would have the respondent be thinking about a person, not a field of study. So how does that influence the results?
Interesting. So you think that these, just as a point of clarification, that's a really great point. We were thinking about this as, and probably should clarify when I'm talking about it in the presentation, as trust in the climate science community or GMO science community, which were the questions that we were asking it. Not necessarily about a specific person or just the laws of nature or science in general, but really getting at whether or not you trust the information coming out of these communities. But this doesn't seem like it.
The way I read it, and some of the questions even say scientists and science community, makes me think I'm thinking about a person's, not science. And then the way you're framing kind of the attitudes and the dependent variable is trust in science, not scientists. But the questions really gear me towards thinking about persons, not a field.
Yeah,
That's how I'm reading it.
I see how you can read that into it. I think what we were really trying to get at is trust in the science community. We use science community a lot in these questions, and I think that was hopefully gearing people towards thinking about science community in general. But I agree that, yes, the way that I presented it, just for brevity in speaking, may have been a little.
Just to back you up on that, the results that you quoted earlier from the GSS are also trust in the leaders of the science establishment or science institutions. So trust in science in the survey world is just the way of talking about trust in institutions, people, groups, and things like that.
Yeah,
that's all the survey work, I think.
And I think that from a policy perspective as well, when we think about trust in science, what really matters is are you trusting the information that the scientists and scientific community are telling you about this issue? That's what will inform public opinion on the issue.
So I have a certain question about the attitudes towards government. What does that mean, and is that going to depend on?
Yeah, so it's fairly similar. This was taken from mostly from the General Social Survey battery about attitudes, what they call attitudes towards government.
So this might change quite a bit based on when you do it. So, for example, people's opinions about the current administration, is going to influence answers to these questions versus the previous one, and you might get exactly opposite results for political ideology, especially. But like in your discussion, it didn't seem like you thought about.
Yes, that's a fair point. So, for all transparency, we did this in 2016 pre-election. There is quite a bit of literature that I didn't have time to get into in this study that makes clarifies the relationship between favorability or attitudes towards government and corporations and political ideology. So in general, liberals tend to have more favorable attitudes towards government, while conservatives tend to have more favorable attitudes towards corporations. Lots of variation there, and lots of ways that, examples that you can give to counteract that. But generally, that's what the basis of the literature has been. So that's kind of where we were, the theoretical framework that we were launching from. We did see a more similarity in political ideology in terms of attitudes towards government and corporations than we were expecting, and fairly positive attitudes of both across the political spectrum. So, yeah, I think your point is very valid, and you definitely have to take political context into account when you're doing this, but that's kind of where we were at.
So I'm curious of what the actual kind of policy implications to this is, because on one of the first sort of graphs you showed, at least the way I read it, it was that it was like 1 to 6 scale, is that people generally don't trust the science, they generally don't trust corporations, and they generally don't trust the government. So as a policymaker, how do I deal with that? In essence, they don't trust anybody or anything. Generally speaking, if you just use that 1 to 6 scale, like 3.3 to me is not very high in trust, right? Like I would expect at least 4 to maybe even say that people are trusting things, right? So how, in your analysis, kind of the actual policy implications of this, of how you actually then develop a policy, I don't know how to deal with those numbers.
Yeah, so people's level of trust in institutions is always lower than I think we hope it would be. Especially in the United States, we're a fairly individualistic society. There's a lot of mistrust of government on both sides of the aisle. I think for policy implications of this, a lot of this and a lot of the work that I do looks at communication strategies and how we're communicating about scientific issues to the public. And what this helps us understand, and then we haven't had it, I'm probably not going to have a chance to go over it, but the second paper that we're working on actually tests some of that and tests how a message coming from a government or a corporate source changes people's policy attitudes based on whether they have favorable or non-favorable attitudes towards that source. So in terms of policy implications, I think of it in a lot of ways in terms of communication strategies, potentially thinking more deeply about who we're communicating, from whom we are communicating these different scientific messages, and who's receiving them. So things like micro-targeting and paying close attention to how people feel about the source of the message that they're receiving.
It's interesting when you're talking about the messaging coming from certain sources, because even when you get into government, you could crack that open into a lot of different spaces where, like, you have the military, Department of Defense. Trust in the Department of Defense might be very high among conservatives, much more so than the EPA, perhaps, or other sources. And so when I was at Thanksgiving, it always happens at Thanksgiving, we were all talking about climate change. It was a great opportunity to talk about it, right? No, but I started saying,
Sounds like a disaster.
I'll tell you why it wasn't.
We changed the climate of Thanksgiving.
You know, and heated up a little bit. I was in Florida. No, so we were talking about climate change, and I've got the hogwash corner, the angry uncle sort of thing, right? And that's fine. But it was like the Department of Defense is coming out with strategies based on climate change and increased, in the North Africa and Middle East, and potential food shortages and instability resulting from climate change. We have messaging from the Department of Defense that talks about this. We have our Navy and Russia's Navy that are actually basing military strategy on the breakup of sea ice. And so he got quieter when the branch of government that he had the most trust in is all of a sudden making real strategy about it. And they're not protesting, like General Mattis isn't out there, waving protests in DC, but he's making real strategies with hundreds of millions of dollars behind them. So I wonder if you could crack it even further.
Yeah, and think about which part of...
Because I think that is maybe underutilized?
And if I could
I'm not
add
in
to
this
that-
field, I will think about it.
I have a question kind of building on that, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about the 3,000 people who answered the survey, age, race, region
Yes,
of country,
so
things like that?
I
And how you
don't-
recruited them?
Yeah, absolutely. I do not, apologize, I do not actually have the demographic breakdown available here, but they were representative samples. So the survey firm, YouGov, these were individuals who are on ongoing panels that YouGov has, so that's how they recruit them. But they create a survey frame that, or the population frame, representing, or that is reflective of the median demographic, of the countries. So these were statistically, representative samples of the populations in these two countries. They were I have some discussions in the paper in appendices that's looking at the mean age and income and education compared to the means from the consensus, or from the census, and they're fairly similar. So we can take this as a more or less representative sample, recognizing that in survey research, you're never really gonna have a fully representative sample. Yeah.
Just wondering, any plans, or would it be interesting to look across Europe on different countries? And I don't know if you might find even bigger differences between Germany and the US. I'm curious as what you think.
Yeah, so I was really excited to be able to do this cross-culturally and look at Germany, because so much of the research in this field is just looking at the United States. And I think that really limits us for a lot of reasons. We just have different political systems. I think political research, public opinion research in the US is so hampered by the high levels of polarization and salient political ideologies here that it's nice to look in other contexts as well. I also recognize that Germany and the United States are not that different in terms of they're both Western countries, they're both highly affluent, well-educated Western countries. I think it would be really interesting to expand this both into other countries in Europe. I'd love to hear if you have any particular ones in mind, or more specifically into a more diverse set of countries, potentially in other continents as well.
For a lot of us, the trust in science is an important aspect of what we hope to accomplish in our careers. Does this give you any insight into how we can communicate with the public to gain their trust?
Hopefully this new paper that will be coming out later this year, hopefully, and then since I won't get to talk too much about it, but looks at whether or not it makes a difference where this message is coming from, where these messages are coming from, and again, just reaching back to some of the policy implications of communication strategies. I think gaining a better understanding of how attitudes towards sources of messages matter, so thinking more about what are the trusted sources, what aspects of government, corporations, other types of institutions do people actually already have prior attitudes that they agree with and they're favorable towards. I think that getting more science coming from those sources is going to be a really important key to increasing overall levels of trust in science. Yeah, in the back.
So the results on GMOs in Germany made me think about a couple of basic questions I haven't thought about before, but which seem important. For example, do people in Europe think that the scientific consensus on GMOs is that they are not safe? Because the government does not permit them. Do people think that science and the government are harmonized in Europe, just on an opposite conclusion to what they are in the US? Because that would have big implications for whether you trust their conclusions.
Yeah. So we didn't ask any prior questions in this survey about what they thought the scientific consensus was, and I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at, because whether or not you trust the science might be different if you think the science is saying what you already believe in or not. So I think you're right, that would be a really interesting thing to look at going forward. I don't unfortunately have insight on that in this survey. But.
And in a similar sense, who is / who do people think is the GMO science community in Germany and Europe? I mean, Bayer, but since they don't sell GMOs there, do they actually count? Like, who does that there, and both objectively and subjectively?
Yeah, I don't know enough about who the most active players are in that field. I know that's something that Thomas would be able to speak to more. He's kind of been leading this charge on the European front. But the data that we do have, I mean, I've found scientific data, and I talk about it in the paper, also from Europe, showing that GMO foods are safe, but there's such a cultural taboo still on that I think that you may be onto something that the perceptions of the science there might be different than what it actually is.
I was just curious, most of this work is on means, and I was wondering about the variances, especially in that one in terms of trust of science over time and stuff. Do some of the groups have variances that decrease, that they're all in lockstep, or, so you find some conservatives that are very different. Is that part of the analysis?
So this one is what you're talking about.
Well, that was just one of them, but in general,
Yeah, so he doesn't report on the variances here. I'm not sure that that's reported out in the GSS data.
What about in your studies? Do you take that into account? I mean, given your statistical models, are you assuming the homogeneity of variances? Or?
So we are. I show some, like in this. Let me get back to this. The standard errors are fairly small, and also in the regression tables, they're not huge, so we're not looking at like major variances. What I will say is that I'm afraid to go into the data from the other paper, but just in the other paper, which is we look at policy preferences, and there is significant variation on policy preferences, even when we're subgrouping by trust in the source or trust in science, where we see positive effects of this message, but the variance is so high that it's really hard to tell really what's going on there, which is why I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into how people may be reacting differently to these attitudes.
Because certainly that would influence your policy. It sounds like something for machine learning or something.
Yeah, not my forte, but if anyone else here is knowledgeable, that's good.
So, I've seen quite a few different presentations or studies that look at political ideology and trust in science or trust in specific issues like climate change or GMO. Has anyone done like a meta-analysis sort of to look at how that has changed over time about the same issue? So for example, the slide that you had with trust in science from 1974 to 2010, that's like, science is very different in 74 and now. So that to me just doesn't make sense to have a measure like that. And internet happened and it didn't change, nothing changed. That seems odd. But in that sense, like, I think it would be useful to have trust in climate science or trust in GMOs. Because some of those issues, I'm hoping that what people were skeptical in science in 1974, some of those issues now are resolved. And, oh yeah, it's not true, but I'm hoping that I'm hoping that more people believe in evolution now than did in 1974. So in 2050, someone does a study.
That the Pew study.
The one that.
The evolution is going to take too long.
Pew
to
did
get back
that
to,
for a
but
while.
there was still a huge gap. This was from 2015 on use of evolution among the public and scientists. So I think it's a really interesting idea, and I hope that maybe someone will do it. I know that there were not a lot of very specific questions about types of science that were asked in polls back in, the 70s, 80s. It was general, just science. And it's more recently that we've been making the differentiation between the two. So I'm not sure how far back we can kind of do that meta-analysis, but especially as we go forward and we realize there is such a difference in trust in different types of science, that's going to be really necessary.
Okay, with that we can we'll see you next week.